So good afternoon, buenas tardes, and welcome to today's very important discussion on ensuring equity in Puerto Rico's economic recovery process. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. I'm Dr. Fernando Rivera, Director of the Puerto Rico Research Hub at the University of Central Florida. We are proud to bring together this esteemed group of elected and community leaders on their mission to better inform policy decisions that affect Puerto Rico. The Puerto Rico Research Hub was founded in 2018 and looks to investigate the Puerto Rican population and demographic trends in areas including housing demands, job creation, health issues, social integration, and education. Additional areas of emphasis includes bilingual training, disaster response and recovery, and partnerships in the community. We are very proud of the partnerships we have built and of the support we receive locally from champions right here in our community. For additional opening remarks, it's an honor to introduce Orange County District 4 Commissioner Maribel Gomez Cordero, someone who's committed to this community and cares deeply about the Puerto Rican population here in Florida and on the island. Commissioner Gomez Cordero has received several recognitions for her service and dedication to Orange County's Central Florida community, including the Educational Foundation for the Advancement of Child Welfare with a Person That Makes a Difference Award by the Florida Coalition for Children of Central Florida, among many others awards. It is my pleasure to introduce Commissioner Gomez Cordero.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes a todos. Gracias, Fernando. It's an honor for me to be here and as a local leader to be part of what events you all do, right, in UCF. And one of the things that I have to talk about is the importance of becoming and coming all together as Puerto Rican. And I have to say that when Maria hit Puerto Rico and we received all the people that we received from Puerto Rico, we had to do something to engage with these people. And one of the things that I want to bring, and I'm going to be brave in what I have to say, brief in what I have to say, is that we have to learn to engage with our own people. When they came from Puerto Rico because of Maria, you know that one of the things that the mainland here, USA territory, and a lot of people didn't know is that we were US citizens. And that was one, I have to say that we had a lot of bad things happening, you know, when Maria hit Puerto Rico. But one of the good things that happened was that people knew that we were, I mean, a lot of people knew that we are US citizens. And I have to say that when they came here, I worked very close with them, with Hispanic Federation and all these agencies from the community that were trying, you remember it was like election year on 2018, and then everybody wanted to register them and they were all going to them and they were not receiving that feedback and that good, that importance and that right that for them to be registered to vote, because we needed to meet their needs. They came with no money, they came leaving the island, they came with no roof, with no clothing, with no jobs. And we were there to say, we need you to register to vote. So we were not connecting. We were not connecting, and that really didn't provide any unity between us and them coming. And we welcoming them. So the strategy was changed into listening to what they need was, what it is that we can do for you, how can we help? And then that's when all those numbers came up, for us register. Well, I wasn't part of the registration committee or volunteers or staff, but I was part of the staff of Hispanic Federation o Iniciativa Acción Puertorriqueña. And one of the things that we changed was that how to engage with them. Before we were requesting or asking anything from them is what can, we can do for you. Well, actually, because everybody was in an emergency mood that time. You remember that we were all running up and down. There were, hundreds of people coming over. We didn't have no room to put them, no homes to put them, no apartments, no nothing. And we had to really work very hard for them, you know, to stay in the hotels and in all these different places so they could, you know, receive the services that they need. But one of the most important thing is that the people that were in the airport waiting for them, those agencies, when they were asking them how we can help you, they was just saying, they, you know, they came with no money, they came with no, I mean, no homes, no nothing. They wanted jobs. How can I get a job? I want a job to, you know, have money to get a home and to pay rent. And so that was very impressive when they came and they said, I don't want nothing, you know, I don't want you to give me anything. I want to work. And, you know, that was a very good one. And just to let you all know, I am born and raised in Puerto Rico, in La Punta del Este, in Ceiba. And I'm very proud to say that, and, you know, I still have my parents, they're still alive. They went through, you know, Irma when Irma hit, but it didn't hit that much, but it hit, and then Maria, and all the things that are going through now, and all the issues and status of the government and all this thing, they have been through all of that. And I have been living here 24 years, but I make myself, you know, to go to the island 2 or 3 times a year because I have all my family over there still. And I love it when I go there, but I have to say that for us, I mean, me knowing over there, now being in one of the, I can say local government, you know, top position, I have to say that as a leader, I have to say that we still need to get, we have a long way to go before we can see a very good unity and all of us coming together for the best interest of our island in Puerto Rico. And I have to say that we as Puerto Rican, we are very, I don't know, social, we are very huggy, we are very friendly, we like to talk, we like to, we all are cousins. You know that when we go, oh, este es mi primo, esta es mi prima, you know, we all are families. So I don't know why it's so difficult for us, you know, to come all together for the same purpose, which is to, you know, save the island from whatever is going on. So I have to say that the other thing that they are saying is that why all these topics that we are going to discuss today are very important. It's very important because right now we have a very heavy, I don't know, atmosphere, environment, or whatever in elections coming into Puerto Rico right now in November 3rd. And we know all the things that our island have been going through with the corruption and with all these things that are not in the best interest of the people that live in Puerto Rico as well. And us over here, right, in the main island or the big island or nation, we have a call, and our call is to help our people over there, our island, our government, everybody over there. So I know there has to be changes. There has to. I mean, it's no way that Puerto Rico could continue, you know, governing the way it is and, you know, getting different results. It has to be a different government, different governors, different, I don't know, policies and rules, regulations in order to change and for our island to benefit from all the good things and the lovely things and the beaches and everything that we have over there that are, you know, very important for us to develop and in a good way so our island can, you know, continue reaching. You know, there's a lot of money coming in to the island, but we need to stick up and help our government and help our island. You know, there is a lot of people that came from Maria, but there are a lot of people that went back after Maria. They went back, and we have to develop all the jobs and all those, you know, training, education, and so our island can, because, you know, I know we are over here, but we like to go over there, and we would love to go over there and work for our island. I know we would like to, but it need to change, and it takes for all of us to come together for that to happen. Thank you. And, you know, I'm here in my office right here in downtown Orlando. You can come anytime, you can call me, and we can meet, we can continue talking about anything you want, but more than anything, I'm here to serve you and to be here for all of us so we can get united and, you know, be together for our island. God bless you all, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Commissioner. And what I'm going to do right now is briefly introduce our panelists, and then after that introduction, I'm going to read the the rules of the webinar, and after that, we'll begin with Representative Soto. So we'll start also introducing our panelists. We start with U.S. Representative Darren Soto. He was elected in 2016, and he represents Central Florida in Congress. The 9th district includes all of Osceola and parts of Orange and Polk counties. The first Floridian of Puerto Rican descent to serve in Congress, Representative Soto graduated from Rutgers University and George Washington University School of Law. We are also proud to say that he's a current co-sponsor of the Puerto Rico Recovery Accuracy in Disclosures Act, PRRADA, which is what we are going to be primarily discussing today. And the legislation will strengthen the requirements for disclosure and eliminate potential conflicts of interest in Puerto Rico's economic recovery process. So welcome, Representative Soto. Our next panelist is Dan Lemech. He's an attorney for Marval Value Partners. He previously served as the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Michigan as the acting United States Attorney, First Assistant United States Attorney, and the Chief of the Criminal Division. Mr. Lemech prosecuted cases involving white-collar crime, money laundering, public corruption, healthcare fraud, narcotics, conspiracies, and homicide. Mr. Lemech graduated from Temple University in Philadelphia and studied law at the University of Detroit School of Law. Welcome, Mr. Lemech. Finally, we have Arnaldo Oliveras, and he's in the Business Development and Retention Consultant for the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce of Metro Orlando. As principal of 180 Commercial Real Estate Solutions, a full-service commercial real estate advisory firm attending Florida and Puerto Rico markets, he has assisted many mid-level size companies from Puerto Rico to expand their businesses, operations, and presence to Florida successfully. So welcome all. But before we begin, I want to invite you to submit questions to the discussion by the chat feature, and we will have dedicated Q&A portion at the end of the webinar.
Thank you.
Now let's dive right in. Representative Soto, please walk us through what we got to hear and where we stand today. Many know about PROMESA, but might not have fully comprehended. Now PRRADA is something new being discussed. Please tell us about more, and you have about 10 minutes to give us your insights. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks. I'm going to start briefly here in Central Florida because I think it's important to know how our community got here and why we care so much about our brothers and sisters back on the island. As was discussed a little already, Puerto Ricans came down from the tri-state area and up from the island in the 80s and 90s, starting out with, and really getting to critical mass by the late 90s, early 2000s. My own family had both those migrations. I came down from New Jersey with my family from up north, and the rest of my family came up from Arecibo and Manatí in Puerto Rico. And it's important to note that, we came to political power, a lot of us over the course of the 2000s, with the first actual elected official being Robert Cabrera in the late 90s, but then state legislators and commissioners and school board members. And that really makes sense when you look at the time we were here. By the time Hurricane Maria hits the island, there are already almost 1.2 million of us. And I think that sometimes gets lost in the debate. There were a ton of us here already. A huge Puerto Rican population with a culture of our own. Behind me is a painting from Amari Diaz, who's since passed, Mi Orgullo, which it's a young child wrapped in the Puerto Rican flag with a pava hat. We have artists, we have elected officials, we have business leaders, we have writers, we have musicians, so many others in our subculture here. You can appreciate, with some of us coming directly from the island and some of us coming from up north, how close we still maintain our ties to the island. And how do we get there with this fiscal crisis? We saw through the 60s through the 80s, a great economic expansion in Puerto Rico, fostered in part by banking and pharmaceutical industries and medical devices and manufacturing, moving from an agrarian society to a manufacturing society, fostered in part by the 936 tax exemption. For better or for worse, in the 90s, we saw that tax loophole or that tax opportunity close here in Washington due to subsequent changes. That led to an exodus of a lot of companies from the island, although keep in mind, still 50% of the island's economy is manufacturing, including predominantly pharmaceutical, technology, medical devices. We saw this robust economy enter into a recession starting in the 2000s. And that really contributed greatly to the economic woes of the island because it was such a sudden shift over that time, and debt started accumulating beyond the control of the island. And when you have a retracting economy and you have great needs, I mean, the legislators there had to make tough decisions about feeding people, about public housing, about economic development and all these different things. And the debt got away from them. And there was a tough decision in Congress before I got here. I was in the state legislature at the time about a provision that changed back in, I want to say it's 1983 or 82, that took Puerto Rico out of the bankruptcy code. And there's still some debate over why that was, whether it was a clerical error or whether it was deliberate. There's not a lot of legislative intent behind it, but they were taken out of it. And then on top of that, there requires them to prioritize debt service above everything else, which is crazy when you think about having to take care of your people first. And so it led to this perfect storm of an economic recession, booming debt, the need under the Constitution to pay debt service, the inability to file bankruptcy, and it's not a state, so it doesn't have sovereign immunity. And so now we get into a dynamic in Washington that was really important to understand how it got there. So you had a Democratic president, but you had a Republican Congress. So the simple idea would have been just adding Puerto Rico back to the bankruptcy code. And that was something that I know that a lot of Democrats supported, the President Obama at the time wanted to do, but that was an impossibility because you had a Republican Congress that felt like that wasn't enough accountability for the island, something I vehemently disagree with, but that was their rationale. And, you know, all these debts have investors to them. So there is winners and losers to this, and some of them are Puerto Ricans on the island themselves, because a lot of the pensions were held, some of their investments were held in this debt. So you have the pensions being caught up in this, you have investors and bonds and all this stuff, and all of them are affected by how much debt is cut and otherwise. And then you have these sort of vulture bond companies coming in, buying up bonds for 10, 20 cents on the dollar. So there's a lot of legitimate questions about why should these people get paid 100% or 80% when they paid so little on the dollar for it. So you have everyone from pensioners to Puerto Ricans who invested in Puerto Rican debt as an investment, trying to support their local government, to these stock speculators and bond speculators and the like, which gets us to the point that then the Republicans won't let Puerto Rico just get back in the bankruptcy code. They want a specific process to a federal board to oversee changes to pay the creditors back and to basically make cuts to the state, to the Commonwealth's budget. And while there's a lot of talk about how economic development is included in the act, there's actually no chapter on that. So while it was one of the goals, there was never anything concrete in there. So it really wasn't an economic development act like people talk about, even though it's referenced in there. Most of the sections deal with the debt and the board. Obviously, drastic cuts happened and continue to happen. And the fiscal board is like a federal takeover to a certain extent of the island's government. They have certain authorities that they've exceeded to into the legislative power to craft a budget. And then all the while, there's now a bankruptcy case going on. Some debt was made illegally and has been taken out of the bankruptcy case. Other debt is being fiercely litigated. And the Junta Fiscal continues to be a very unpopular entity, and the PROMESA Act itself very unpopular for the obvious reasons. So there's been big calls for reform, and there's been some shakeup. Now we have a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and a Democratic House. And so you had mentioned that ensuring equal standards for Puerto Rico's economy, which in there, the Puerto Rico Recovery, Accuracy, and Disclosure Act of 2019, or PRRADA. The key to understand is this is one bill that is now part of a much larger bill. So I'm going to talk about it, but the real bill to watch, and that's why it's so important to have these conversations between academia and legislature and the Congress. That's a section of now the amendments to PROMESA Act of 2020. That is the main reform vehicle. So we don't really talk in terms of PRRADA. That's one part of the bill, and the amendments to the PROMESA Act of 2020, HR 6975 is where all the action is going to happen, and it incorporates PRRADA in there. So what does the bill do? We first talked about disclosures. There's been issues with the fiscal board having ties to financial industry, to creditors and otherwise. So this is both concerning, but also not unusual. Because when you're dealing with adjusting finances, you're going to go to people in the finance industry who have the expertise to do it. Some of them may have ties because of long careers to other entities. Some of them, and this is where I get really concerned, may have been involved in the original debt. And so, one, it's about disclosure. And we need to avoid having anybody still have any financial interest who serves on the board. But let me go through some of the other key aspects of the amendments to PROMESA Act that was co-introduced by myself, Congresswoman Nydia Velasquez, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Congressman Jose Serrano. It's been talked about quite a bit on our local radio, but it's important to talk about it in terms of the Puerto Rican Research Hub. So we talked about avoiding conflicts of interest on the oversight board. That was the PRRADA aspect, and basically includes eligibility requirements for members, employees, establishes an ethics board within the oversight board. It's to prevent members of the board from holding financial responsibilities, like we talked about, to third parties and making decisions based upon an outside financial consideration. Second, the second reform assigns federal funding for operation of the oversight board and debt restructuring proceedings. This is really important because right now the Puerto Rico was paying for the board that is then imposing cuts on them. It was like a smack in the face, adding insult to injury. Now the board will be federally funded, and it won't come out of debt service and all these different things. Another key, we protect essential public services and define it. Essential services was never defined. So a lot of people think that the PROMESA Fiscal Board went too far in telling the legislature what to do. It specifies that public education, public safety, healthcare, and pensions are an essential public service, ensuring adequate funding for the governor of Puerto Rico and the oversight board. The pensions in particular have a lot of relation to Central Florida because we have many, probably thousands of pensioners who retired from Puerto Rico to Central Florida. We talked about those immigrations that set the table. So this is not just folks on the island. These are my constituents who care about not just generally the issue of debt on the island, but the pensions that they rely on, seniors in our district. So when we're talking about why should we care about this, in addition to our cultural allegiances and the fact that there's business between the island and Central Florida, there are people relying on pensions that could get cut under PROMESA. And so it's an issue that Central Floridians care deeply about because they're relying on it. It also protects the University of Puerto Rico. We can't continue to innovate in Puerto Rico if we're cutting their main university system, much like we care deeply about the University of Central Florida. So it ensures that there's enough funding allocated to the University of Puerto Rico for the institution to fulfill its role as an essential public service. We went down to the island through the Natural Resources Committee that I serve on, that despite its name has a jurisdiction over all insular lands, including the territory of Puerto Rico. And we held the first congressional hearings in Puerto Rico in the history of the nation. And we saw and heard from so many passionate students from the University of Puerto Rico, talking about avoiding these cuts and major increases to their tuition. We heard them, we added it to the bill. Another key part, because there's all this talk about cancel the debt, get rid of it all. We have certain limits under the Constitution about ex post facto laws and on contracts where we can't just say all your debt is eliminated. But under the bankruptcy laws, we can strengthen bankruptcy laws to give the judge more discretion over that. So the fifth reform is allowing qualifying territory that meets the specific criteria to discharge some of its unsecured financial obligations. So some of this debt is unsecured financial debt. Some of it that doesn't have an asset back to it or some other financial backing to it. And so we opened a whole new class of categories that the bankruptcy judge would be able to discharge or greatly reduce, improving Puerto Rico's ability to be able to litigate and reduce even more of the public debt. And lastly, we heard from everybody about having an independent audit. So we created an independent commission to audit Puerto Rico's public debt. Because right now it's been audited by PROMESA and not everybody trusts the fiscal board. So we would have, it would be a commission within the government of Puerto Rico composed of financial, accounting, legal, and other experts to determine the amount of outstanding public indebtedness, the financial sustainability of the debt, and what policies can be implemented by the government of Puerto Rico to address the debt. And they would have to use U.S. generally accepted government accounting principles. So essentially, we've heard a lot of these reforms, and we've tried to put ones forward that we think have a chance at passing. And that's why you had every, at least on the Democratic side, every member of Congress of Puerto Rican descent put input into this bill and sign on to it. And the last thing I'll talk about just briefly is sovereign immunity. Right now, Puerto Rico doesn't have state sovereign immunity. It's a territory. Commonwealth is just a term of art. It's a territory. Even the Supreme Court confirmed that about 2 years ago. And right now there's a plebiscite going on. The Puerto Rican people will decide statehood, yes or no question. It's up to them. But should they decide that they want to be a state, I don't know how many of you have been following it, but the terrain in Washington is shifting at a rapid rate that has not been seen in decades, right at this very moment. Major leaders, whether it's the party nominee for the Democrats, whether it's the minority leader in the Senate, whether it's Democrats and Republicans in the House coming together, there's a lot of political capital to potentially, if Puerto Ricans agree to becoming a state, to admit them and the District of Columbia into the Union as states as early as next year. I know it seems like a question that's gone on for 120 years, but this is moving rapidly right now because of all these different issues. And one of those aspects would be state sovereign immunity, which would then potentially make PROMESA obsolete and allow them to negotiate from an even stronger position as a state. But that's up to the Puerto Rican people for them to decide. But I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about that aspect of all this dynamic going on right now as we head into the elections. And I want to thank you, Dr. Rivera, for having me here today. Obviously, these are cutting edge issues that the Congress is gripping with right now as we speak.
Thank you, Representative Soto. So now we turn to Dan. We know that a lot of these issues are very complex. And when it comes to something like a government's bankruptcy process, it only gets more complicated. Dan, you're an expert in the bankruptcy space. What are the issues that at hand when it comes to bad players? And why is Puerto Rico's process not held to the same standard as the processes in the United States?
Well, those are all good questions, Dr. Rivera, and thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to try to explain what's different about the Puerto Rico bankruptcy process than a normal bankruptcy process in the United States. And the differences are stark, and they are not beneficial for the people of Puerto Rico. And it's something that can be changed. And Representative Soto has taken the lead in sponsoring a bill to change that, the PRRADA bill, which I'll talk about. So first, I'd like to just discuss the general way that a corporate bankruptcy works in the United States. And when a corporation goes bankrupt, they no longer have to pay their bills. If you're a bakery and you're getting flour from a mill, you no longer have to pay that mill. Companies that go bankrupt no longer have to pay their workers' pensions, their workers' health care. If they're a trucking company, they may not have to pay the mechanic shop that keeps the trucks running. And those folks who are owed money by that bankrupt company are called creditors. And those creditors often receive no money until the bankruptcy is completed. And when the bankruptcy is completed, they often receive pennies on the dollar. Or if they are unsecured creditors, often they receive nothing. But there's one very special class of creditors under our bankruptcy code that receive 100 cents on the dollar, and they get their money in real time, generally every month when they submit an invoice. And under our bankruptcy code, those folks are called professionals. And that generally means lawyers, accountants, and consultants. A bankrupt company hires lawyers, accountants, and consultants to shepherd them through the bankruptcy process. And you don't tell a large New York law firm, we want you to file all these legal pleadings for us and represent us in bankruptcy court, and we'll see what's left to pay you at the end of the bankruptcy. It doesn't work that way. Those folks get paid 100 cents on the dollar in real time. But the trade-off under our laws that allows those people to be paid when workers and pensions and suppliers are not getting paid is the idea that those folks must disclose on the public record under oath who their clients are, where their money is invested. The court needs to be convinced that those professionals do not have a conflict of interest in the advice they are giving to a bankrupt company. And I think one of the reasons why you don't see, workers coming to a bankruptcy court with pitchforks and torches in their hands is they think that we have a fair and open and transparent process that reveals how the bankruptcy advice is being given to the bankrupt company. So I'll give you an example of a potential conflict of interest. Let's say a big company like General Motors goes bankrupt, which it did 12 years ago. General Motors may have owed $100 million to Barclays Bank and $100 million to Chase Bank. They hire a bankruptcy consultant to help them get out from under that debt. And what those consultants do is they negotiate with the folks that are owed money and try to get that debt down. And they may say to the bankrupt company, you know what, we think you should pay Barclays Bank 85 cents on the dollar. You should pay them $85 million, and we can negotiate that deal for you. But Chase Bank, I think you should pay them back 35 cents on the dollar, $35 million. And they may be able to negotiate that as well. But does the person who's giving that consulting advice have a conflict of interest? Does the company giving that advice own stock in Barclays Bank, but not in Chase Bank? Is Barclays Bank a client of the consulting company giving that advice, and therefore the consulting company wants to favor that particular creditor for its own financial self-interest? These are things that bankruptcy judges in the United States must know. They have to know this, and it's the law that they know it. And professional firms have to file disclosure documents that often list thousands of clients and investments that affect their impartiality, that could be a conflict of interest. And the law that requires that in the United States bankruptcy system is something called Bankruptcy Rule 2014. Bankruptcy Rule 2014 requires consultants, lawyers, and accountants being paid with bankrupt companies' money to disclose on the public record under oath, under the penalty of perjury, where all their potential conflicts of interest lie. Now that brings me to Puerto Rico. In 2016, Puerto Rico was in dire financial straits, which we all know. Puerto Rico could not pay its bills. Puerto Rico had debt of over $100 billion. And as Representative Soto said, under our US bankruptcy code, Puerto Rico could not file for bankruptcy to try to get out from under that crushing debt burden. There was no ability for them to do that. So Congress literally had to pass an act of Congress to do one thing, to allow Puerto Rico to walk into a federal court and file for bankruptcy. And that law is called PROMESA. And Congress passed that law in 2016. Puerto Rico immediately took advantage of the law and they walked into bankruptcy court and they filed for bankruptcy. Just like other big entities that go bankrupt, Puerto Rico was allowed to hire professionals. They were allowed to hire lawyers, accountants, and consultants to help shepherd them through the bankruptcy process. One of the consultants they hired is the world's largest consulting company and the oldest consulting company, and it's called McKinsey. They hired McKinsey to help get them through the bankruptcy process. One of the biggest debts that Puerto Rico owed and still owes and is being handled in the bankruptcy is bond debt. The government of Puerto Rico issued bonds, and a bond is simply a promise to pay you back an amount in the future. If you give me $5 today, I'll pay you back $10 in 10 years. That's what a bond is. And Puerto Rico issued many, many billions of dollars worth of bonds. One of the issuers of those bonds is the Sales Tax Authority of Puerto Rico. It goes by the Spanish acronym COFINA. And COFINA was the authority that collected sales taxes on the island. They were very flush with cash. COFINA collects all the sales tax revenue dollars. And because they had this money, they issued bonds that were considered rock solid, reliable bonds. COFINA bonds backed by the full taxing authority of the sales tax folks on the island. But then, sorry, the sales tax authority filed for bankruptcy under PROMESA. COFINA went bankrupt. So those bonds that were trading at 100 cents on the dollar, you and I could pick up on the public market for 9 cents. These bonds were almost worthless. A bond that would promise to pay you back $1 in the future, you could buy for cents. And what McKinsey didn't tell anyone, and by the way, McKinsey has been paid over $80 million to date for their work in the Puerto Rico bankruptcy process. And that $80 million is Puerto Rico taxpayer money. And what McKinsey didn't tell anyone was they owned $20 million worth of COFINA bonds. And after McKinsey got hired, the Financial Oversight Management Board that runs the Puerto Rico process decided to pay those bonds that were trading at 9 cents on the dollar. They decided to pay them back at 93 cents on the dollar to try to instill confidence in lenders so they would buy Puerto Rico bonds and keep the island afloat financially. A bond you and I could buy for 9 cents, they decided to pay back at 93 cents on the dollar. And McKinsey owned $20 million worth of COFINA bonds. And they hid it, they concealed it, they didn't tell anyone. And our bankruptcy system is supposed to be an open and transparent process. But here's the rub, and here's why we're here today, and here's why what Representative Soto is doing is so important. What McKinsey did on the island by concealing their financial self-interest in the outcome of the Puerto Rico bankruptcy process did not violate the law. And the reason for that is when Congress passed PROMESA, which was passed quickly, this was a financial emergency, Congress neglected to include the disclosure provisions of United States bankruptcy law. Congress neglected to include Bankruptcy Rule 2014, which requires professionals to disclose their financial self-interest and other potential conflicts of interest. It's just not there. And I personally have walked the halls of Capitol Hill and spoken to people who were there when PROMESA was passed. I've spoken to the congressman who actually drafted PROMESA, and they've told me it was an oversight. It simply is something that just wasn't included. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't done to favor one side or another. It's just missing. And all that PRRADA does, the Puerto Rico Recovery, Accuracy, and Disclosures Act, is reinstate the disclosure provisions for professionals in Puerto Rico to the same extent as they exist in the 50 states. And at the moment, what you have is one set of disclosures, transparency, openness for citizens of the 50 states, and another basically non-existent set of disclosures for the people, the United States citizens who live on the island of Puerto Rico. And what it means is the people of Puerto Rico are really being treated as second-class United States citizens. And what this bill does is put them on the same footing as their brother and sister citizens who live in the 50 states. It is a good government bill. It is not a partisan bill. It has support from Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives. There is a bill pending in the House. There's a bill pending in the Senate. And it is simply a sensible, right thing to do to pass it. And again, we really, really thank Representative Soto for taking such a leadership position and being an original sponsor of PRRADA. And we urge its passage. And I thank you again, Dr. Rivera, for having me.
Thank you, Dan, for that information and the overview. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Arnaldo Oliveras.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Representative Soto, Commissioner Gomez, and Mr. Lemish. Thank you for being here, and thank you for Fernando for the invitation. Now, I've been listening from the point of view of a small business owner, and it's very interesting that each person's point of view. To Representative Soto point, yes, we are in this situation right now. Unfortunately, no, we cannot embrace a benefit or a right such as bankruptcy because we're not a state. Now, on the other hand, something very significant here, it's to know how this whole climate comes into play as to the business in Puerto Rico. Having a business in Puerto Rico, it's exponentially more difficult than having a business here in the United States. Let's begin with the logistics of it, such as permits. Permits here, you can find them in 45 days, maybe 50 days at the latest. In Puerto Rico, you can definitely, depending on the municipality, you can definitely go through a 6-month process, maybe a 7-month process. So there goes that. Also, there are many policies involved that are one-sided, and it just basically becomes very difficult to run a successful enterprise in Puerto Rico at this moment. Not only that, and with touching briefly the fact that our infrastructure, it's not the best one in the world, beginning with the power authority. It's an uncontrollable expense. 1 month you can pay on a 2,500 square foot space, you can pay perhaps $3,000, $3,500 in power in 1 month. Next month something happens and you receive a bill for $5,000. That throws your budget out of whack. Now, on the flip side, Central Florida, basically, like Representative Soto mentioned, has been having this mass exodus from earlier times than Maria. People think that Maria, that all this migration occurred because of Maria. Maria basically just pushed us a little further into that migration. I recall Dr. Rivera speaking at a Hispanic Chamber of Commerce event, by the way, big fan of your work, that 71% of those Puerto Ricans coming into the state of Florida due to Maria have a higher education, and they are professionals. That goes without saying that in Puerto Rico, for labor in Puerto Rico is a little bit scarce depending on your profession. I'll go even further. I have clients that are doctors and they are making inroads into Central Florida. Because of the bureaucracy of our island, we do have a regulating organism that basically regulates the health insurance practices in Puerto Rico. So if a doctor undergoes a procedure and bills the health insurance, you know, let's say they bill $10,000 for a procedure they provided to a patient, you know, in 60 days, you might receive a check for $300. And then next month, another check for $20. I mean, to this day, clients of mine are receiving checks that are 10 cents. So, you know, go figure. Here in Central Florida, it's a whole different ballgame. Now, this has been fertile ground for Puerto Rican concepts. And I do want to say that we have the pleasure of representing clients such as Leonardo Fifth Avenue in Winter Park, Senor Paleta in Florida Mall. We've also done work for Novus, and Orlando, Central Florida as a state, it's basically second nature in terms of our business expansion plans. It definitely is. We have family here. The language is English, but you know, there's also pockets that, you know, this Spanish makes it, it's almost a second language. And business is a little bit more fluent in terms of the logistics from permit all the way through to securing a site, all the way through even sales revenue and taxes. Very important subject.
Thank you, Arnaldo. Now we'd like to move on into our question and answer portion. So if you have any questions, please use the chat function and make sure that you have them directed towards a specific member of the panel. If you want to ask for some of the panelists, don't be shy. We haven't received any yet, but I'm sure that, you know, with all the topics that we discussed, there might be some out there. I would like to place a question, right? Sometimes, you know, I always get the question of, you know, the relationship between Puerto Rico and specifically Central Florida, right? And it seems that more and more, it seems that, you know, the relationship between the two is very fluid. So let me, you know, let me know a little bit about your insights on what you think about that, and then we'll move on to some of the questions that we have from the panel, from the audience.
Well, I'm happy to start. It's as fluid as a JetBlue flight. The most popular one being around midnight because it's the cheapest one to get between the island and back. People live here, they'll move back, they'll move here again. And you got to look at it in more historic trends. You have a lot of folks like my family who moved up to New Jersey and New York in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And they ended up retiring, getting decent pensions, and wanted warmer climate and something closer to home, something closer to what you know, my dad had as a child back in Manatee. And we found ourselves here, and our cousins from Arecibo beat us to it. But that's a microcosm of the grander migration. But you have commercial ties, you have cultural ties. You would be surprised how many reggaeton artists or visual artists from Puerto Rico actually live here too. We just had Luis Fonsi in the other day, one of the great musicians of the island. He went to Dr. Phillips High School. Little known fact, I think, until he announced it the other day, and then went back down. So there's this constant flow. And I think you have a lot of people who really consider both places their homes. And for a lot of newer residents to the mainland from the island, we're more the destination because you have the ease of business, as was just discussed. The weather is much more familiar. You have a lot of the various cultural aspects. And it's not the huge cities that New York, Chicago, or Philadelphia are, and Boston that folks went to early on. It's a little easier of a transition. And so we've reached this critical mass where I have every expectation that the census will declare us officially the largest diaspora in the nation from Puerto Rico, and that transitional ease and that familiarity is a big driver of it. But that connection is ongoing.
So we have a couple of questions. Maria Landron asks Congressman Soto, how can we get involved to make sure PRRADA is passed? And similarly, Carmen Torres also asks Congressman Soto, do you believe we will have the votes in the House and Senate for PRRADA?
So I believe we will get, and remember, PRRADA is part of a bigger bill. So I mentioned all the reforms already. It is a great idea that was incorporated in the main effort, which is amendments to PROMESA. I'm hopeful it'll pass the House this year. Ironically, even though we put this forward, there has been some opposition on the island. And it's not, you have some folks who are supportive of it, some folks who want to do more, some folks who want to do less. So there hasn't been a consensus on the island on what to do because it's such, politics are fairly passionate in Central Florida. They're very passionate on the island. So we've had some opposition or some questions rather about how it would work among Governor Vasquez and the legislature down there. Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon, the resident commissioner, has had some questions on. So there hasn't been a full sign-on yet by the government down in Puerto Rico and by the resident commissioner, although she and I work very closely on a lot of these issues, and she signed on to the PRRADA issue. But there are these issues that have to be worked out. So there could be a passage before the end of the year out of the House. Now, of course, that wouldn't be the Senate, but the goal is to queue it up so that next term, depending on the makeup of the Senate, we may have a bill ready to go that could pass quickly in the first 6 months or year next year. And, we took great pains to be aggressive without making it impossible to pass the Congress. Because a lot of us would like to wave a magic wand, eliminate all these debts, eliminate PROMESA, just end it all. But there's a lot of constitutional issues that prohibit us from being able to do all that. So we've gone as aggressive as we could while still being able to get some bipartisan support to try to pass this thing, focusing on eliminating some additional debts like the unsecured debts, focusing on protecting some core areas that are essential services, public safety, public education, healthcare, pensions. We heard from students from Puerto Rico, so we're protecting the University of Puerto Rico. We heard about needing an outside audit because people don't trust the fiscal board. And of course, the fiscal entanglements and conflicts of interest that are in PRRADA that are now incorporated into this larger bill. So what can you do to help? Well, it's pretty simple. We have a Natural Resources Committee and we need support. We need support among the Republicans because while many of them may agree in just that one part of the bill, they definitely don't agree on the whole bill right now. And we'd be willing to compromise on certain things. And we need more buy-in from the island to the bill in general, because right now, as I said, there's not consensus down there. A lot of people want more, some people want less, and some people just, there's a paralysis of action because it's such a sensitive topic. But I'm a big believer, you just got to go right at it and solve the problem as best you can. You're never going to have perfect solutions, but you got to make reforms that can be done that are helpful. So send emails, letters, phone calls to anybody on the Natural Resources Committee and tell them you support amendments to PROMESA Act and the PRRADA Act, which is included in that act. And those would all be helpful because we really would hit the ground running next year if we could pass a bill, even at a committee this term. Everything in Congress can take a while. And when we rush it, like what happened with PROMESA before I was elected, obviously I didn't vote on PROMESA and I opposed the original version of the bill that we're now obviously we're amending it now. So those are things you could do to help. And that's where we stand in the Congress right now.
Thank you, Congressman. We have a question from Rocco Anastasio, and this is for all the panelists. Loss of culture is something that happens with migration. There has been a lot of talk over the years and in today's session regarding migration to the mainland from Puerto Rico. Are there any programs available to encourage Puerto Ricans living on the mainland to move back to the island? In a sense, regentrifying the island with Puerto Ricans who might not have previously called the island home.
So we wouldn't have that on a federal level. That would be more incentives that Puerto Rico would have. And they do have some that have been criticized and some that are more popular. So they're encouraging farm to fork and agriculture. So you're getting some millennials from anywhere from New York City and Chicago and Boston to come down to the island to do organic farming, to the more controversial ones about tax havens for hedge funds to be able to invest down there without paying many taxes. So you have a lot of growth happening in San Juan in real estate right now, driven from these tax shelters that a lot of billionaires and millionaires from New York City, particularly in hedge funds and otherwise, have moved to the island and are now funding that building boom. So there's growth in jobs, but there's not a lot of revenue being collected from it, at least from a income point of view. There is from local fees and permits and things like that. So, but that, the most of that is in Central Florida. We're agnostic to moving in or out. We want to make sure Puerto Ricans, if they decide to move to Central Florida, we welcome them. We don't want people to be forced to move because the island's economy is so terrible. So a lot of my focus is on improving the economy, but we're certainly not going to have any, it's our own interest to have folks from across the nation move to Central Florida. So we wouldn't, as an area, engage and encourage people to move away from our region, obviously. But Puerto Rico obviously has an interest to have folks move back or to stay. And certainly we support them in those efforts. While our main focus is to encourage people to become Central Floridians, regardless of whether they're from Puerto Rico or the North or they're from other countries. We're a very international area. So in Central Florida, we Puerto Ricans want everybody to come here, but certainly support our brothers and sisters back on the island in their efforts to do that with their funding, like we do with our funding here in Central Florida.
And one last question. And so if the bill that contains PRRADA passes and transparency comes into play, what happens to Mackenzie's role? And then I think that's probably for you.
Sure. So you can't retroactively apply it. So it would go forward for any new firms. There's going to be a shakeup in the PROMESA board members as terms come to expire. So that'll be one of the biggest things people will see. And they have the authority to hire new folks on, and companies may see the writing on the wall and just comply. And if there's any renewal, then of course that would apply to them too. So there's ways to pull them in and into those disclosures, among others. But this would be for everybody, including the members of PROMESA, the staff, the contractors, and it's really important. But I do want to balance it out with one fact. When you're having a board like this, which I hope one day we won't need it anymore. And there were testimony in our committee that within 3 years, this thing will be brought in for a landing and the fiscal board will dissolve if things go as they are. Of course, Hurricane Maria and COVID has hurt that. You're going to necessarily have people from the financial sector come in and staff these areas because they're the experts. And many of them who have a lot of experience are going to have relationships over the years. It's just inevitable. So the disclosure is important, but it's not unusual for these sorts of relationships to exist because they're hiring in experts who work in the financial industry, but the public needs to know about them, and they shouldn't have any active conflicts of interest. They may have worked for this person or that person over the years, and in the financial system, you're going to have that, but there can't be any active financial interest. There can't be any. We need to have all the history disclosed so the public knows. And as new appointments come up, new members of the fiscal board, which it's a tough gig because people don't like what is happening. So a lot of people are leaving. That transparency will be there. But my hope is that we won't need it anymore soon, whether it is through a decision on status, whether it is through us resolving the debt issues in the bankruptcy court and it going in for a landing. Puerto Rico would be best served once we bring the PROMESA board, let them ride out into the sunset and bring back full sovereignty to the island.
And then just if you can quickly give your comments to that question.
Yes, thank you, Doctor. I want to be clear, this act, the PRRADA Act, is not aimed toward one company. It's not aimed toward McKinsey. It's aimed toward every professional consultant and accountant and law firm that's working in Puerto Rico. And I think to date, Puerto Rico has paid over $1.7 billion to professionals to help them with the Puerto Rico bankruptcy. So what would happen to McKinsey? They would be treated the same as every other professional. Hopefully they would disclose like the new PRRADA Act would require them to do. And if the judge in New York felt that they were conflict-free, then they would continue doing their work and get paid if the board wanted to continue to use them.
Thank you. So with that, I thank you for your questions and to all our panelists for their insightful perspectives and their time today. As we close out, I want to encourage all our attendees to stay engaged on the issue. There is much going on, the COVID-19 pandemic, racial justice protests, natural disasters in and out of Puerto Rico, and on top of it all, a presidential election. I urge you to stay focused as well on the issue of ensuring Puerto Rico receive a fair and equitable oversight at this crucial time for the island. If you're interested in learning more about this issue or want to lend your voice by getting involved, we invite you to reach out to us here at the Puerto Rico Research Hub, and we will direct you to existing resources. Have a great afternoon, and thank you again for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.